At precisely 2:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time today, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney executed a strategic maneuver that has fundamentally dismantled the existing power balance of the US-Canada crisis. This was not a minor diplomatic adjustment, it was a total restructuring of how the world conducts business, leaving the White House in a state of shock as officials struggle to grasp how quickly their leverage has vanished. For weeks, the global community watched as Canada issued an ultimatum set for March 18th, and most expected Carney to remain in a defensive, waiting posture until President Trump decided whether or not to comply with Canada's demands. Instead, Carney refused to play the role of the passive bystander. He chose this moment to go on the offensive, seizing the initiative before the United States could even formulate a formal response to his previous threats. The centerpiece of this offensive is the newly announced Democratic Trade Alliance, DTA. This is a formal, binding framework that officially unites 40 nations under a single economic banner. This isn't just a group of countries expressing support for Canada. It is a legal commitment to preferential trade relationships, coordinated resistance against any form of economic coercion, and a mutual pledge to defend the sovereignty of every member state. By forming this alliance, Carney has effectively created a global economic shield that protects these 40 nations from American trade pressure. The alliance has already established its headquarters in Ottawa, with Canada positioned as the central coordinating power, signaling a massive shift in where global economic decisions are made. The timing of this announcement is a calculated masterstroke designed to maximize pressure on the US government. The DTA is scheduled to go into full effect on March 20th, which is exactly 2 days after the March 18th deadline Carney gave the United States to meet his demands. This timeline sends a clear and aggressive message. Canada is no longer waiting to see what the US decides. By setting the launch date for the alliance just 48 hours after the deadline, Carney is demonstrating that Canada has already moved on to a post-American global order. He is signaling to the world that if the United States fails to comply by the 18th, the transition to a world where the US is economically isolated will begin almost immediately. This move has completely flipped the script on the Trump administration. While Washington was busy trying to figure out a counter-strategy to Canada's initial ultimatum, Carney was busy building an entirely new global trade architecture. The United States, which has traditionally been the primary architect of global trade rules, now finds itself as a mere spectator on the sidelines. Washington is currently watching Canada build a massive, independent economic system that functions without any American participation and is specifically designed to operate in direct opposition to American interests if necessary. This strips the US of its veto power over global affairs and forces it to react to Canada's moves rather than leading the conversation. The consequences for the United States are immediate and severe. If the March 18th deadline passes without the US meeting Canada's terms, the United States will wake up on March 20th to find itself locked out of the largest and most powerful coordinated trade bloc ever created in the 21st century. This isn't just about a dispute with a neighbor, it is about the US losing access to the preferential trade terms enjoyed by 40 of its most important trading partners. By creating this alliance, Carney has ensured that if the US chooses a path of non-compliance, it chooses a path of total economic isolation. The US is no longer the one deciding the terms of the relationship. It is now the one facing the choice of joining the New World Order on Canada's terms, or being left behind entirely as the rest of the world moves forward without it. To truly grasp why this development is a catastrophic disaster for United States interests, you have to look at the 4 core principles or pillars that govern how this alliance functions. These are not just suggestions, they are binding rules that change how the entire world does business. The first pillar is preferential trade among members. This means the 40 nations in the alliance have agreed to give each other special treatment that they will not give to the United States. They have committed to zero or significantly reduced tariffs on each other's goods, faster customs processing at borders, and shared regulatory standards, so their products move seamlessly from one country to another. Because these 40 nations represent over 60% of the entire world's GDP, they have essentially created the largest free trade zone in human history. By removing barriers for each other while keeping them up for the US, they make American products more expensive and harder to sell. This leaves US companies at a permanent disadvantage in the global market. as it is now much cheaper for a country like Japan or Germany to buy from Canada or Mexico than it is to buy from America. The second pillar is the coordinated response to economic coercion, which is being described by experts as a trade NATO. In the past, the United States could use its massive economy to bully or isolate a smaller country by threatening them with sanctions or trade bans. This second pillar makes that impossible. Under these rules, if the United States tries to target a single member of the alliance with economic pressure, the other 39 nations are required to step in and help. They will provide financial assistance to the targeted country, offer them better trade terms to make up for lost American business, and launch coordinated diplomatic countermeasures against the US. This shifts the balance of power entirely. The United States can no longer pick on countries one by one, because doing so now triggers a fight with a unified bloc of 40 nations that controls more than half of the world's wealth. The third pillar is sovereignty protection, and it is the most politically aggressive part of the agreement. All 40 members have pledged to jointly oppose any attempt by a larger power to undermine the independence or territorial integrity of a smaller state. While the language is written to apply to anyone, it is a direct response to recent threats from the White House regarding the potential annexation of Canadian provinces. This pillar turns a local border dispute into a global stand. It means that if the United States makes any move to interfere with Canada's internal borders or its government, it is effectively declaring a conflict with all 40 member nations at once. This creates a massive deterrent that prevents the US from using its military or political weight to force Canada or any other alliance member into submission. The fourth and final pillar is democratic governance and transparency, and this is designed to permanently break American influence over global institutions. For decades, international organizations like the World Bank or the IMF have been dominated by the United States because of its veto power and outsized voting weight. The Democratic Trade Alliance does the exact opposite. It operates on a one-nation, one-vote system. This means that in this new alliance, Canada has the same amount of power as Germany, and Costa Rica has the same vote as the United Kingdom. No single country, no matter how rich or powerful, can veto a decision or dictate the rules to the others. This level of equality is incredibly attractive to middle-sized and developing nations that have felt ignored or controlled by America for years. By building a permanent headquarters and secretariat in Ottawa to manage these rules and settle disputes fairly, Mark Carney has ensured that this alliance isn't just a temporary protest against the current administration. It is a permanent, lasting institution designed to lead the world into a future where the United States is no longer the boss. The sheer scale of this alliance represents the most significant shift in global trade power since the World Trade Organization was created decades ago. This is not just a small group of Canada's neighbors, it is a massive, planet-spanning coalition that includes the world's most developed and influential economies. The 40 founding members include all 27 nations of the European Union, the United Kingdom, Mexico, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. It also pulls in critical regional leaders across Africa and Latin America, such as Kenya, Colombia, Chile, and Costa Rica. By bringing these specific countries together, Mark Carney has effectively united the dominant powers of Europe, Asia, and the Americas into a single cohesive unit. Together, these 40 nations represent a staggering $58 trillion in combined GDP and encompass approximately 1.8 billion consumers. This is no longer a regional trade bloc like the old NAFTA. This is a global economic powerhouse that officially rivals and in many ways exceeds the total economic might of the United States. The speed at which this coalition came together is unprecedented in modern history and highlights how desperate these nations were for a change. Diplomatic sources have revealed that Prime Minister Carney began these high-stakes, secret negotiations on March 6, the very same day Mexico officially broke ranks with the US to form a strategic partnership with Canada. Carney's message to these world leaders was direct and persuasive. He argued that the current crisis with the United States proved that even the closest allies can no longer rely on American restraint, economic stability, or respect for national sovereignty. He convinced them that the US had become too unpredictable to be the center of the global financial system and that these 40 nations needed to build their own insurance policy to survive. He framed the Democratic Trade Alliance (DTA) as the only way to protect their citizens from being collateral damage in future American trade wars or political disputes. The response from these 40 countries was overwhelmingly positive and immediate, because many of them were already at a breaking point with Washington. European leaders, who have been exhausted by constant threats of the US withdrawing from NATO and the imposition of sudden steel and aluminum tariffs, saw the DTA as their best chance to achieve economic security, independent of American goodwill. Similarly, major Asian powers like Japan and South Korea, who rely heavily on stable trade routes and predictable markets, viewed the alliance as essential protection against the volatility of American trade policy. Latin American and African nations joined because they saw an opportunity to finally be treated as equal partners in a system where no single superpower could dictate their laws or threaten their borders. Because the shared fear of American economic aggression was so high, the negotiations moved at a pace never before seen in international law. Within just 72 hours of Carney's first outreach, all 40 nations had reviewed the framework and committed their governments to the plan. They bypassed the usual years of bureaucratic red tape and finalized the founding documents in record time. This rapid-fire agreement allowed them to present a completely unified front to the world this afternoon, leaving the White House totally blindsided. By the time Washington realized what was happening, the deal was already done, the signatures were collected, and the new global order was established. The United States is now facing a reality where its most important historical allies have officially decided that they are safer and more prosperous working with Canada than they are working with America. To understand why this alliance effectively strips the United States of its global power, we have to look at what are being called the four receipts, the specific ways this deal cripples American leverage. The first receipt is the trade diversion impact, which fundamentally changes where the world's money goes. Because the 40 alliance members have agreed to give each other zero tariffs and fast-track customs, they will naturally stop buying from American companies and start buying from each other. For example, if a company in Germany needs to buy car parts, it will now be significantly cheaper and faster to buy them from Canada or Mexico than from the United States. This massive shift means that 60% of the world's trade will begin to bypass America entirely. As a result, American exporters will lose their customers, US factories will see a drop in orders, and thousands of American jobs in export-heavy industries will likely disappear. The US will be left on the outside of a massive members-only club, forced to pay higher fees to sell its goods while everyone else inside the club trades for free. The second receipt is the collective defense mechanism, and this is the end of the era where Washington could use its economic size to bully other countries. In the past, if the US was unhappy with a specific country's policy, it could threaten them with targeted sanctions or trade bans to force them to comply. Under the Democratic Trade Alliance, that tactic is now useless. This mechanism acts as a trade NATO, where an attack on one is an attack on all. If the United States tries to place sanctions on even a small member like Costa Rica or Kenya, all 39 other nations, including massive economies like the UK, Japan, and the entire EU, will immediately step in to provide that country with financial aid and better trade terms to offset the American pressure. Washington can no longer isolate a single nation because that nation now has 39 powerful partners standing behind it. This effectively takes the economic big stick out of America's hands. The third receipt is the sovereignty principle, which creates a global wall that the US can no longer cross. This principle was written as a direct response to recent threats from the White House regarding the annexation of Canadian provinces, but its impact goes much further. It creates a permanent, coordinated deterrent against any form of American intervention or political pressure. If the US attempts to interfere with the internal government of a member nation or threatens their borders, all 40 alliance members are committed to responding simultaneously with coordinated diplomatic and economic opposition. This means that the US can no longer use its military or political weight to push its neighbors or allies around. Any move against the sovereignty of one member triggers a massive unified backlash from over half of the global economy, making the cost of American aggression far too high for the US to pay. The fourth receipt is the governance structure, which ensures that even if the United States tries to fix the situation later, it can never dominate this group. In almost every other international organization like the UN or the World Bank, the US has a special seat, extra voting power, or a veto that allows it to control the outcome. The Democratic Trade Alliance has specifically banned this. It uses a one-nation, one-vote system where every country is treated as an equal. This means Canada has the same power as the United States would have if it ever joined. There are no special privileges and no vetoes. This setup prevents the US from joining the group and trying to take it over from the inside. This fundamental shift in how global decisions are made removes the primary tool of American power, the ability to dictate terms to the rest of the world. By protecting its members under this DTA umbrella, the alliance has made American economic leverage, once the strongest force in the world, virtually ineffective. The atmosphere inside Washington, D.C. today can only be described as a frantic mix of panic and total chaos. When the Secretary of State was first briefed on Carney's announcement at 3:15 p.m., the gravity of the situation was instantly clear. This was not just a trade spat, but a strategic catastrophe. By 3:45 p.m., an emergency session of the National Security Council was underway, where top officials reached a grim conclusion. They realized that if the Democratic Trade Alliance (DTA) becomes fully operational, the United States will officially lose its role as the center of global trade. The Council recognized that the US is no longer the only game in town, and that for the first time in nearly a century, a massive chunk of the world's economy has found a way to move forward without American leadership. When President Trump was finally briefed on the details at 4:30 p.m., he initially dismissed the move, reportedly calling it just another weak alliance, and insisting that the US has plenty of allies. However, his senior advisors had to pull him aside and explain the devastating reality. This alliance includes almost every traditional US ally, from the UK and Japan to the entire European Union. These are the very nations that form the backbone of American global influence, and they are now actively choosing to trade less with America and more with each other. When the president reportedly asked if the US could simply join the alliance to neutralize it, his advisors had to deliver more bad news. Joining would require the US to accept the one nation, one vote rule, meaning Washington would have to give up its veto power and treat every other member, no matter how small, as a total equal. The president reportedly found this requirement unacceptable, realizing that the US cannot control this new group from the inside. By 6 p.m., the White House was forced into a defensive crouch, issuing a formal statement that attempted to downplay the news. The administration called the DTA a thinly veiled attempt to undermine American leadership, and argued that no collection of nations could ever truly replace the opportunities provided by American markets. However, despite the tough language, the statement was notably empty of any actual plan. It offered no concrete strategy on how to stop 40 nations from moving forward on March 20th. While the White House was spinning the news, the State Department was behind the scenes trying to bully foreign ambassadors. US officials held emergency meetings where they called joining the alliance an unfriendly act and threatened that it would damage their bilateral relationships with America. But the ambassadors did not blink. European representatives reportedly told US officials directly that if they wanted to prevent this alliance from forming, they should have treated Canada with respect, instead of creating the very crisis that made the DTA necessary. The alarm has spread to Capitol Hill, where the mood among lawmakers is increasingly grim and resigned. Senator Chuck Schumer spoke to reporters, lamenting what he called the end of American leadership in real time. He pointed out that the US has essentially pushed its closest friends into the arms of a new Canadian-led system because they no longer trust Washington to be a reliable partner. On the other side of the aisle, Senator Mitch McConnell was equally blunt, calling the 40-nation alliance a damning indictment of the current administration's foreign policy. McConnell warned that the president now has a very narrow window to prevent permanent, irreversible damage to the American economy. He urged the White House to stop the posturing and accept Canada's terms immediately, because by March 21st, the United States might find itself living in a world where it is no longer the most important player on the stage. As we approach the critical March 18th deadline, the global community is staring down two very different futures. In Scenario 1, President Trump chooses to comply with all 5 of Canada's demands before the clock runs out. In this situation, the immediate emergency is de-escalated. Canada would promptly lift its financial restrictions and resume the flow of vital energy exports, which would prevent a total collapse of the American power grid and stabilize the markets. However, even if the US complies, the Democratic Trade Alliance (DTA) does not simply disappear. It still launches on March 20th, as scheduled, because the 40 member nations have already lost their trust in American reliability. The difference in this scenario is that the alliance would likely take a more cooperative tone toward Washington. They might offer the United States observer status, which would allow the US to participate in discussions without having a vote. In this world, the era of American dominance is officially over, but the US avoids being totally isolated. To stay relevant, the United States would have to learn to play by the DTA's rules, accepting a role as a partner rather than a boss. This path leads to a slower transition where the US remains part of the global economy, but it no longer holds the power to dictate how that economy works. In Scenario 2, President Trump refuses to meet Canada's demands, and the March 18th deadline passes without a deal. This path leads to immediate and devastating consequences. On the morning of March 19th, Canada would implement its Phase 2 inches measures, which include even harsher economic penalties and a complete permanent cutoff of all energy supplies to the United States. This would send the US economy into an instant tailspin, causing widespread blackouts, factory closures, and a massive stock market crash. Just 24 hours later, on March 20th, the DTA would launch with an explicitly anti-US posture. The 40 member nations, acting as a unified bloc, would begin a coordinated effort to protect themselves from American retaliation. This means they would start divesting their money from US financial markets, pulling their investments out of American stocks and bonds, and shifting their trade away from the US dollar. The long-term damage in this second scenario is even more catastrophic for the American people. Within 6 months of the alliance's launch, US trade with these 40 nations could drop by as much as 40%. Because these countries represent the majority of the world's consumers, American businesses would have almost nowhere left to sell their products. This would plunge the United States into a deep, prolonged recession with unemployment rates reaching levels not seen since the Great Depression. Furthermore, as the DTA members begin trading with each other using a basket of different currencies, the US dollar would lose its status as the world's reserve currency. This would cause the value of the dollar to plummet, making everyday goods like food and fuel significantly more expensive for American families. In this scenario, the United States becomes a massive but lonely island, an isolated economy that is cut off from the global frameworks that drive modern prosperity. Mark Carney has already made his move, and as the deadline nears, it is clear that the world is choosing sides. Currently, most of the world's power players are choosing to stand with the alliance, leaving Washington to decide if it wants to adapt to this new reality or be crushed by it.